sort of kerosene do you use? It's so bright. We don't often see that. But good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be with you tonight, especially as I'm about 220 years old. You know, not bad for 220, anything? That's age, not weight, please. But I want to share with you tonight, aided by my assistant, of course, a few of the tales, some true, of what it took to get us to where we are today. We don't often think about what happened back then and how often it came within a hair's breadth of not happening at all. But fortunately for all of us, thanks to people like me, if I do say so myself, it did happen. And I'm here tonight to share with you some of those events. My assistant asked me to put this up as well. He did participate in the development of this book several years ago, and we just happened to have a few copies out in the lobby. Just thought I would mention that. And also, he wanted me to dedicate this presentation to his very good friend, Sam Pease. Sam was a delightful individual, bit of a curmudgeon at times, though I have to admit, but he's the one that got my assistant into this idea of the history of the oil and gas industry here in the United States, and particularly here in Pennsylvania. So thanks, Sam. It's been a wild ride. The references that we've used in this production are here. I'll be happy to share any of those with you as we go through, and if you'd like to know more about them, let me know. And we've got, of course, no production is by itself a single individual. And there are lots of folks here that have helped a great deal, and I want to mention in particular Ms. Sarah Jones, who put together all of the educational material that is associated with this, that the the young people this morning took back with them. And Sarah, thanks very much. If you'd take a bow there. That's Sarah. Thank you very much. And we seem to have an unwanted visitor. Let's see if I can maneuver this thing. It's a bit before my time, or no, after my time. And see if we can get this thing out of here. That's better. My assistant taught me all that I know. But these are the folks that really brought this to you tonight, and especially Dr. Miller at the New Brunswick Natural History Museum. He is the one that shared with us the samples that we will pass around in a moment. But I came into this world in 1797 in Cornwallis, Nova Scotia, over here on the edge of the Bay of Fundy. I was right in the middle of 12 children, big families in those days, and I was the sixth son of 12 children. My middle name came from my mother's maiden name, and 1797, that's very close to an important date in this country. And my family, of course, is traced back to a very great and well-known scholar by the name of Conrad Gesner from Switzerland, philosopher, naturalist. He was the one that really started the sort of systematic study of nature. And so we're very proud of our ancestor. But the boyhood home there in the Annapolis Valley, and although we came from New York State originally, around Tarrytown, there was this little fracas that took place around 1776. And, you know, people had to choose sides, and they had to get ready to go for it. And unfortunately, we chose the wrong side. We were on the other side. And as a result, at the close of the war, we were then required to vacate the premises. And so my family then moved to Nova Scotia, and that's where I made my appearance. And we were, of course, raised with all kinds of stories. My father fought in the Revolutionary War, again on the other side, but we don't talk about that much now. And at the age of 5, I came to the notice of a local minister, Robert Brice, who took me on as a pupil and taught me my ABCs and all of the interest that could come from early schooling at the age of 5. And remember, it was kind of rough in those days. We'd come in the morning and the ink in the inkwell would have frozen solid. Then you'd have to build a fire and thaw out the inkwell before you could begin writing. And there was a rhyme that he taught me. Has a lot of wisdom in it. He who ne'er learns his ABC forever will a blockhead be. But he who learns his letters fair will have a coach to take the air. Which is very interesting because at that time I didn't even know what a coach was. But I learned my ABCs. So I was not a blockhead. And where better to grow up? Where better for a very inquisitive individual to grow up than on the shores of the Bay of Fundy, some of the highest tides in the world. How delightful to go down and see the fishing boat tied up at the dock and go back down in another few hours and find the fishing boat on the bottom. And it's sort of a long walk to unpack your boat if you haven't done it when the tide was still in. And you go out in the woods and you go out to the stream, and lo and behold, you see this wave working its way up the stream, all the way up. And the stream is flowing this way, but the wave is coming this way. The high tide forces the water in the stream back upstream. They say water always flows downhill. Well, not all the time, especially if you've got that enormous tide coming in. But what a delightful place for a young person to grow up. All along the bay, my friend Bill Webster, whose father was a physician in the area and was always teaching us how to do various things as a scientist, we get trapped by this incoming tide. And we'd have to scramble up on a high rock or up on a bank. And there we would sit for the next 6 hours. Sometimes we missed supper as a result, because we had to wait for the tide to go out again before we could get back. But it was worth it. We got all kinds of fossils. These figured stones that had a great story to tell. But in the early 1800s, we didn't know how to interpret that story. That came later as we were collecting the data. And often, Bill and I would work and do small experiments at home. And you could always tell when we were playing around because there was this lovely aroma of rotten eggs coming out of the back room. Much to the chagrin of my mother, but nonetheless, she tolerated us. And, you know, the occasional little explosion, but, you know, small ones, not big ones, small ones. But what a great learning environment. The stimulation that comes from that. But it wasn't all rocks and fossils. I also learned music. I was pretty handy with the violin and the flute. Loved the Scottish airs. The family would sit around and we would have a great time playing music. And it says Gesner was a broad-chested man with black hair and dark eyes, medium height. Well, I'm part of that anyhow. And wore a sheepskin jerkin, leather breeches, and a top coat, whether in the parlor or the bush. His knapsack typically was crammed with geological equipment, healing remedies, a notebook, and writing tools. He loved a good cigar, fond of music, played the flute and the violin, and was especially partial to Scottish airs. So, you know, that's close. So leave out the cigar, but the rest of it's not bad. And the hair used to be dark, but As we all know, sometimes that change happens. So after the War of 1812, turns out, see, the colonies didn't learn the first time, so they had to get messed up with it the second time, and it ended up the same way. But anyhow, decided at the age of 19, grab some horses. We had plenty of horses in Nova Scotia. Grab some horses, put them on a boat, take them down to the West Indies, sell them at a profit. Great idea. However, the execution was a little different. They didn't take enough food. The horses starved on the way down. They got driven off by storms. So it just failed one time after another. Once even loading up a ship headed out of Halifax, we barely got out of the harbor when the thing was on the rocks. I got stuck on an island, almost froze to death. Finally, somebody rescued me. So much for horse trading. But there's always a silver lining. And in Trinidad, I got to see this great bitumen lake, 5 kilometers all the way around. Huge bitumen lake. Solid in places, but still kind of spongy in others. As you walked across it, you'd look back and your footprints were still in the bitumen. Or you dig out a piece and it would fill up behind you. What a strange, strange thing. Took some samples, wasn't really thinking about what to do with them, but took them back with me. But that bitumen lake plays a very important role later. So it was time to go back in the horse business again. You know, I just never learned. This time with borrowed money. Take it from me, you don't want to go horse trading on borrowed money. Took off with these horses, same result. Made a little profit, but I had a few stops along the way and came back broke. That seemed to be the way things happen. But Bill, my friend, had this really wonderful sister named Harriet. And I thought she was the best thing since sliced bread, except they didn't have sliced bread in those days. And so I finally persuaded her, much against her father's wishes, to marry me. And so we got married in January 1822. Between us, we had 7 children who made it to adulthood, 3 who died in infancy. And again, I borrowed money, never learned, bought a small farm out near Chipman's Corners, which is where her family, the Websters, lived. So there we set up housekeeping. And all was going around, but I wasn't a very good farmer. And then one night, bang, bang, bang on the door. Opened the door. You Abraham Gesner? Yes, sir. I have a warrant for your arrest for non-paying of debts. You're going to jail. Which to me didn't seem logical, because if I'm being put in jail until I can pay my debt, how can I pay my debt if I'm in jail? But logic didn't enter into it. So I had 2 choices. Pay the money, which I didn't have, go to jail, which I didn't want to do. So I came up with plan C. I'd go under house arrest in my own home. And I could not go out the door, because if I went out the door for anything, which is kind of hard given that the privy was out in the back, but we worked that out. We won't go into details. If I'd gone through the door, the sheriff would have come in and confiscated everything. And my family would have had nothing. So I stayed under house arrest. I wrote letters to my creditors asking if they would, please forgive me. I'll pay you back soon. I'm working on it. My goodness, the farm is so much better now than it was when I got it. Your investment is safe. Well, that went over about like the horse trading. They weren't hearing it. So there I was, trapped. I couldn't pay my debts. I couldn't go outside to work so I could get money to pay my debt. What do I do? Well, my father-in-law, he came to the rescue. He said, son, it's time you learn to trade. My trade. So he arranged for me, paid my passage to go to England and study medicine. Went to London. So in the dark of night, out the door I went, into Halifax, on to London, the great city of London. Kind of exciting, really. But knowing that I'm leaving my family and my wife about to give birth, or with a baby, that was tough. Under cover of darkness, though, I got out of Dodge. But you have to remember that at this point in history, there really was no science of geology. It really hadn't been invented. There were people working on the ideas, but as a science, as it's known today, it didn't exist. James Hutton's very famous, James Hutton's very famous book, Theory of the Earth with Proofs and Illustrations, came out in 1795, just a couple of years before I was born. In fact, he died the same year that I was born. And he had this very radical idea that the earth was extremely old. As he said, no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. Well, that was pretty radical thinking. So by the early 1800s, his ideas about the earth were still very much under debate. So there was no real science of geology. It was being created. And I'd like to think that some of my work helped push it along. Charles Lyell, with his very famous book, Principles of Geology, which took many of the ideas of Hutton and put them into an organized science. That didn't come out till 1830. He was still working on this when I was in London. So it was right at the beginning of the development of the geological sciences. But there were all kinds of things to see in London. Museums, new fossil finds, these mysterious big animals, many of them discovered by Mary Anning down in the Lyme Regis area. Now there's a story. Whoa. Well, I won't go into that now. So it wasn't all medicine and patients. And not only that, my professor, John Abernathy, he had this little informal group of like-minded people who were involved in science, were involved in all kinds of fresh ideas. And lo and behold, one of those that came in was Charles Lyell. So I got to meet Lyell. And we discussed his book that was coming out. And what an exciting time. And then later, I was able to be his guide when he traveled through Nova Scotia, about 20 years later. And occasionally, I would have problems with various things, particularly in physiology, about why this part of the body does this and so on. And I remembered back to my father. When I was just a little kid, and I would ask my father countless questions. You fathers in the audience will know about that. And when he couldn't answer one, he just would look at me and said, son, God made it so. Well, when I was in medical school and we'd come up against a problem and I couldn't come up with an answer, God made it so. And this happened more than once. In fact, it became known around the hospital among the students and the professors as Gesner's rule. And so that was my time in medical school. But what an exciting place. London. They had lights on the street. Can you imagine such a thing? Lights, pole with a light coming out, using gas derived from coal. They put Frederick Windsor in 1807, about 20 years before I got there, using coal gas he put the whole street, no, well, we would pronounce it in North America as Pall Mall. They called it Pell Mell. The British have funny pronunciations, but don't tell them I said so. But what an exciting thing to see. Lights along the street at night. No more darkness. No more darkness. But what I didn't know was that actually the same thing had already happened in North America in a little place called Fredonia, New York. They found natural gas, not coal gas, but natural gas, which they piped into the city, and they had the streets lighted when Lafayette came around to take his victory lap. And the whole street in 1825 was lighted with gas, sort of the harbinger of things yet to come. But of course, I didn't know that because I'm from Nova Scotia, and that's the backwoods. Well, things were happening at home. I was gone, but the things were still going. They repossessed the farm, put my family out. They went back with my parents, but the debt was then repaid. So I no longer had the threat of jail hanging over my head. And so just as I was beginning to really relax, a letter arrived from home, edged in black. And it was not from Harriet. It was from my friend Bill. You can imagine what raced through my mind as I sat and opened this letter with a black edge. It couldn't be good. And it wasn't. Turned out that our infant daughter, or our infant son, Isaac, had died. It wasn't Harriet, but we had lost our second son. And at that time, the study of medicine was sort of like an apprenticeship. You didn't have to go a certain number of courses or a certain number of years. You just studied until your mentor decided you were ready. And Dr. Abernathy, the great man that he was, looked at me, looked at my letter, and said, "Your studies are finished." Gave me my certificates, and I was on the next ship back to Nova Scotia. I initially set up a practice with my friend Bill, who was in Kentville, but then later, within a few months or so, I decided to open my own practice up here at Partridge Landing, or Partridge Island. Now that was I never did find out why they called it that. It was a strange name because there are no partridges in Nova Scotia. So either somebody misidentified the bird, or somebody was nostalgic for a place where there were partridges. In any case, that's where I set up my practice. But now, I didn't choose the practice there because it had a lot of patients. No, I chose that spot because there were great geological features all around. I mean, you have to get your priorities straight, right? And every time I would go out on a call, I'd come back with a bag full of rocks and minerals and fossils. And pretty soon the office looked more like a museum than a physician's office. My patients would come in and they couldn't find a place to sit down because the chairs all had rocks sitting on them. And that was a bit strange to tell that tale today. You notice I said when I went to the patient, they made house calls then. What a concept. The doctor went to the patient instead of, well, I won't go into that. But what a chance to wander all through this region and add to the collection. I even saw my first steam engine at the coal mines. Hadn't seen a steam engine in operation. You know, what a wonder of the world that was. Because remember, the Industrial Revolution was really gaining speed about this time. So these were all new things. And all of this hiking that I had done as a kid and all of the work that I did as I was visiting patients, I brought together in a book called Remarks on the Geology and Mineralogy of Nova Scotia. And notice that I added a few titles in here. And it said the earth not only contains within her bosom substances the most necessary and indispensable to supply the wants of man, but also exhibits in her vast museum the most certain and impermeable records of her own history, written in characters not to be mistaken by the most humble, destroyed by the most powerful, nor blotted out even by time itself. What a statement. What a statement. This was 1836. To have that kind of vision was sort of rare, I think is the best way to say that. And the other delightful thing about putting this book together, it was very popular, extremely popular. So much so that I didn't have time for medicine. Never did like it anyhow, but I could go out and do geology. And as a result of that, I was hired by a coal company to go out and do some assessment of the coal lands that they had. They actually paid me to go out and do that work. What, doesn't get any better than that. To be paid for something that you'd probably go do anyhow. What a delightful situation. And also about this time, our 7th child, a daughter, was born named Harriet, and we relocated to St. John, New Brunswick. And I also communicated a series of letters with the Lieutenant Governor, Sir John Harvey. And not only did I correspond privately, but I also wrote a series of letters to the local newspaper, open letters, begging him essentially, in so many words, to start a true geological survey of the province of New Brunswick. They never had that. No one had ever done that before. And of course, I also sent him some stuffed birds and a few mineral samples for his collection. That had nothing to do with this. That was, totally incidental. But in the spring of 1838, I started as a provincial geologist. As I say, the mineral samples, they didn't play any role in it whatsoever. And so I began the work, and we moved to St. John, had a nice house up on the hill. And this is a strange place because they have a river that flows in both directions. You go down in the morning and it's flowing this way. You come back in the afternoon and it's flowing this way. What a strange place. Called the Reversing Falls. And this time of the day it's flowing that way. You come back later and it's flowing this way. Remember the high tides? Remember those high tides? They would force the water upstream. If anybody tells you water won't flow upstream, you get enough pressure at the head, it will. Then when the tide goes down, it would flow out the other way. Now what a delightful place to be. Isn't everywhere that has a river that flows in two directions. Altogether with the survey, I made 5 different traverses. And you can see here each one of these traverses was a different summer's work. And remember, horseback, wagon, foot. Those are the modes of transportation. And canoe, because often I was following rivers as we went up, or following the coastline, using local native people for guides. Became very well acquainted with some of them, even had one come and live with us over the winter. Wife wasn't terribly happy about that, but nonetheless. All of these traverses, taking copious notes. But that very first year, while I was in the field, tragedy struck once more. Our lovely little daughter died. So for the second time, my wife had to bury a child without me with her. That's hard. To do that alone, and I was out in the field. That really hurt. But it was the way it was. There were 5 reports delivered to the governor between 1839 and 1843, mostly about the various mineral resources, including, of course, coal. This was the 1841 report on the 3rd survey. And in that, I made some mistakes, gravest errors. But there was something good that came out of it. That was when, for the first time, I came across this substance, which looked a little like coal, but yet it wasn't like coal. It had nice conchoidal fracture. That is, when it broke, it made looks like a shell, little cracks the way a piece of obsidian would do. In fact, it looked a little like obsidian, but it obviously wasn't obsidian. And as it was found in Albert County, we called it albertite. And do we have some to show the people here? Oh, here we are. We'll pass a piece of that around so you can take a look at it, because this later proved to be extremely important. And as I collected the material, I noted how similar it was to what we had seen at the Pitch Lake in Trinidad. And the obvious conclusion was we were looking at solid petroleum, bitumen, not coal, but bitumen. So I kind of, tucked that in the back of my mind, didn't do anything with it right then. But that was one of the bright spots that came out of those horse trading days. But I mentioned that I had made a grievous error in the reports. I greatly overestimated the thickness of the coal seams. And some mining companies took me at my word, invested lots of money to go out and start these big coal mines, and instead of a 20-foot seam, there was a 20-inch seam. They were not happy. They were not happy. They let the legislature know they were not happy. So as a result, they refused to pay me for my 3rd year's work. Already done the work, but I couldn't get paid. And not only that, there was not going to be any money for the next year. Not happy with that. So what would a normal person do? They'd say, okay, thank you very much, and leave. What did I do? I went out and borrowed money again so I could fund my own traverse, which of course this province greatly benefited from the work later, because I didn't make that mistake of overestimating things after that. And so here I was, in debt again, and out of a job. But we had a bright spot. It wasn't all doom and gloom. I was elected a fellow of the Royal Geological Society of London. How about that? As a result of my acquaintances, you see, when I was in medical school. They had seen my reports. They appreciated the real geology that was going on. They didn't care if the seam was 20 inches or 20 feet. The fact that the seam was there was the important thing. So I was made a fellow of the Geological Society of London, the oldest such organization in the world. A solution, probably suggested by Harriet, my wife. I don't quite remember. One tends to forget those things after a while. Take all of these specimens that I've been collecting, put them into a museum and open it to the public. Charge admission. Have to have some way to get money to eat, right? So it's exactly what I did. In 1842, I set up Museum of Natural History, private museum. The catalog that I wrote to go with it showed that there were over 4,000 samples, 4,000 specimens. Now, of course, you couldn't have all 4,000 out at one time, but we had quite a few. And so things were beginning to look up a little bit. Charles Lyell showed up from London. I got to take him around parts of Nova Scotia, and Lyell was a very interesting individual. He was privately known as the Pump, because everywhere he went, he sought out the person that knew the most about an area and pumped them for information. And then that information would end up in Lyell's book, sometimes with attribution, but most of the time, he kind of forgot about that part. But nonetheless, Lyell came and we had this delightful time traipsing through the woods of Nova Scotia, looking at the rocks. This is the section at Joggins there in Nova Scotia, based on the work that we did together in the field. But admissions to the museum were not enough. I couldn't pay my debts. I couldn't feed the family. Bankruptcy again. Again. I just don't seem to learn. So as a result, the creditors came in, took the museum, they moved it over to the Mechanics Institute, and finally in 1890, it went to the brand new New Brunswick Museum. And that is where the collection is still housed today. The specimens are still there, many of them still with my original labels in some cases. They've done a beautiful job of maintaining the collection. This is Dr. Randy Miller, who is in charge of it. And you can see my assistant here examining some of the specimens that were collected in the early 1800s. And so you can go to the New Brunswick Museum now and see those collections even today. So we returned to Nova Scotia in about 1843 to start all over again. And so because of my reputation with my books, I was doing lecture, I was on the lecture series, had a little practice before today, you see. And so continuing my experiments, especially with the Albertite, was finding all kinds of neat things with the Albertite. I'll talk about that in a moment. And also doing some writing. And this was one of the results, was notes for immigrants, because there were a lot of immigrants coming into Nova Scotia, and I figured, well, they should know something about the place to which they are moving. Of course, a lot of it's about the geology, which I'm sure they were wanting to know, but nonetheless, that's part of the program. So this was in 1847. The problem that I chose to work on was how to push back the darkness. I'd seen the gas lights, and people were pushing back the darkness, yes, by using various burning fluids, such as camphene, this mixture derived from turpentine. And it burned nicely, but sometimes it had a tendency to go boom. And that can mess up your whole day. In fact, one of the burning fluids here, it says, in memory of Ellen Shannon, age 26, who was fatally burned March 21st, 1870, by the explosion of a lamp filled with R.E. Danforth's non-explosive burning fluid. Yeah, not much truth in advertising, huh? Some things never change. Some things just never change. But the main ingredient for their lamps was whale oil. They were going to the far corners of the world, literally. If it had corners, that's where they were going. Out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, for example, at the height of the whaling time, there were over 700 ships coming out of that one port, chasing down those whales. But the problem is it was expensive. We think gasoline's expensive today, right? How about $77 a gallon for sperm oil? Obviously, it was not for everybody. And they give today Greenpeace a lot of credit for, saving the whales. I disagree. I saved the whales. Hadn't been for my experiments with kerosene, there wouldn't have been one left. Not one. Of course, some of the credit can go to Edwin Drake too, but that's another story. So we needed a less expensive alternative. And remember the Albertite? I had discovered something about that. Well, more financial help arrived. In June of 1846, I was hired to make a survey of Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Island is that small island just off Nova Scotia's down here, New Brunswick's here, and it's just off the coast there. Paid 200 pounds, which is a princely sum. Let me tell you, that was no small amount in those days. And so I had found that if you took the Albertite and heated it and then collected the vapors, you produced a nice, clear, burning material that you could put in your lamp, like this. And it burned bright. It didn't have a tendency to explode. It didn't smell as much as some of the others. And so in June of 1846, I demonstrated this at a lecture, public lecture in Charlottetown, and that was the first time people had seen kerosene in operation. And so we want to make a little demonstration here because that's what I had done. I had distilled it, similar device, not quite the same, and I had shown how you could make light with kerosene. And then I had come back and we were in Halifax, and our second daughter was born about that same time. So we demonstrate, wait, let me get my gadgets here. Haven't done this in a while. Sorry, it's kind of smoky. There we go. And so there was our way to push back the night. Imagine trying to do your homework by this. But it was a lot better than whale oil. It burned brighter. It didn't cost as much. And with this, started a revolution. Didn't know it at the time, but what you see here started a revolution. It took a little time to get going, as many revolutions do, but nonetheless, I think it's out this time. I didn't quite, haven't had a lot of experience with those in a while, you see. It takes a little getting used to, but I think that's set. So this was a revolution in the making, but remember, I didn't invent distillation. The idea of distilling petroleum and distilling other fluids had been around for 1,000 years or more. The Arabs in particular were very good at this back in the 1200s. We even created, around 900 AD, these lighter fractions from petroleum in the Middle East. And of course, as we humans have a want to do, we used it as a weapon of war, called the Greek fire, which was kind of a misnomer because they weren't Greeks, they were Arabs, but what do the Europeans know? And they even had double action pumps so they could pump this fluid out in a continuous stream with a slow burning match at the end of the tube so that it would catch fire as it went out. And imagine yourself in a battle at sea with these big tubes attached to the boats, blowing flames out and smoke everywhere. And suddenly out of that smoke, these ships would come, and they often would decorate the heads of those things with animal heads. And there you are on the ship, and suddenly out of the smoke, this head of an animal shows up, and then flame shoots out of its mouth. Imagine the tales you're told when you went back to Europe, assuming you survived. The fire-breathing dragons. Maybe that's the origin. It makes sense. Even Benjamin Silliman Sr. in the 1830s had distilled some of the petroleum that he got from the big seep up in Cuba, New York. And so he had distilled it and got this collection of light straw color, much lighter and more odorous and inflammable than the regular petroleum. So I didn't exactly invent it. And in fact, in Britain, James Young, in 1850, had a British patent for extracting what he called paraffin, which was a liquid that he was distilling from coal. Turns out that's the same as this stuff that I made that I called kerosene, oil wax or wax oil. And so later, as I'll mention in a moment, I was sued by Young for patent infringement, although our processes were different, the end result was the same, and well, I'll go into that a little bit later. But the point is that this process that I had used was not unique, but no one had ever applied it to that liquid or that solid petroleum called albertite. And so in Halifax, I met Lord Cochrane. Again, I needed investors before I could scale this thing up to industrial production. And so Cochrane had the rights, keep pushing the wrong button, had the rights to that bitumen lake that I mentioned down in Trinidad. And so I bought land there in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick area where the albertite was found. And so we were all set to go into production of digging up the albertite and setting up a kerosene manufacturing, when some mining company came in and said, wait a minute, we own the rights to the coal and you're digging up our coal. I said, what do you mean? It's not coal, it's albertite, it's solid petroleum. No, it's coal. Took me to court. I had experts come in and say, no, it's not coal, it's petroleum, et cetera, et cetera. They had their experts come in and say, yes, it is coal. It's found right near it, has to be the same. Well, the jury, who were not scientists, decided that it was coal. And so I lost the rights to mine the albertite. Even though I had discovered it, I had discovered what to do with it. And I lost it. And tragedy struck again while I was out in the field. Once again, our daughter Elizabeth died. And for the third time, my wife had to bury a child alone. That should not happen. And then to top it off, our son Robert was very ill, and not even my friend Bill, who was a real physician, could save him. So we lost 2 children right in a row. And then the Albert mining operation. And I lost that. You know, how many times can one get kicked and still get up again? That company over the next 2 years made about $2 million then out of digging up albertite. And I got nothing. I got nothing. Well, at that point I'd had enough of Canada. I'm out of here. I got patents for my process in New York, which I thought were pretty good. I moved to New York, set up a company, got the patents, the asphalt mining and kerosene company. We went through some various business arrangements, and then it became the North American Gas Light Company. And the patents then were assigned to the company, not to me. I mean, what do I know about lawyering? They handed me a piece of paper and I signed it. I know about rocks, but I don't know anything about law. And that was very unfortunate, because in a very, very short time, they hired me as a chemist, and I was gradually moved farther and farther away from the operation. Now, the kerosene was a lot brighter than whale oil, and it was brighter than gas, and priced at about $1 a gallon. That'd be about $28 today. Well, that's a lot better than 77. Now, it was a little more expensive than some of the burning fluids, but kerosene didn't explode. And in terms of the amount of light produced per unit of fluid, it was better than anything. So the market was really taking off. And they were finding that, following James Young's approach, that they could also make it by distilling the coal. You didn't have to have albertite. You could do it with coal. So these plants were being set up all over the place. And that's when Young came in and sued the pants off of us and won. So the company then had to pay Young a royalty of so much per gallon. Well, by that time, they'd sort of had enough of me, I guess. I was fired. And I said, okay, I'll take my patents and I'll go back to Nova Scotia. And they said, you can go back to Nova Scotia, but your patents stay right here. I didn't realize that I had signed away the only thing that was truly mine. So the family, we packed up, removed and moved back to Nova Scotia, and I hung out my shingle as a medical doctor again. Profession that I really didn't like. I was pretty good at it, but I really didn't like it, because I had to feed the family. So back we went. And at about this same time, a man by the name of Samuel Kerr in Pittsburgh was also giving us some competition. And that competition in particular really helped enlarge the market for this kerosene. Now, Kerr had found that in his father's salt wells in Tarantum, that there was this sort of dark, greeny, greasy stuff that was coming up with the salt water. They didn't know what to do with it, so they dumped it in the local canal, which, of course, made the canal boat operators very, very happy, especially when it caught fire. But that's another story, too. And so when a friend of his, and the story is a little mixed. One report was it was Kerr's wife, and another report said it was the wife of Kerr's friend. In any case, a lady of his acquaintance was ill and was prescribed the American oil, which came out of a well in Kentucky. And Kerr looked at this stuff and tasted it and felt it and said, that looks like the same thing we're dumping in the canal. Aha. As they say, the penny dropped. We had a new business. So Kerr starts bottling this stuff, selling it as the magic elixir for anything that's wrong with you or your horse, internal or external. And he had salespeople all over eastern Ohio and all over the eastern part of the U.S. as far as New York City, and was doing really well, selling all kinds of things. And in about 1842, 43, somewhere in there, he sent a sample of it down to J.C. Booth in Philadelphia, who had been the chemist on the Pennsylvania Geologic Survey in the 1830s. And Booth looked at it and said, you know, hey, why don't you distill this stuff? And here's a little plan for a distillery that you can use. So sure enough, Kerr took it back. He created his distillery. He got his fluid, which he called carbon oil. which was the same as kerosene, and he was in business. And what was different was that Mr. Kerr was doing it not from coal or albertite, which required mining, it required expensive transportation, it required heavy equipment. He did it from petroleum. You skim it off, you put it in a barrel, you take the barrel down and you distill it. Much easier, much easier. But kerosene was really taking off, and if you go today, you can see the historic marker at the corner of 7th Avenue and Grant in Pittsburgh, where he set up his first refinery, a batch system of refining. Then the council was afraid it would blow up, which they had a tendency to do, and so they moved him out to Lawrenceville, because Lawrenceville didn't count, it wasn't part of Pittsburgh in those days. And so the 5-barrel still that he developed and used in the 1850s is now on display at the Drake Well, and the next time you're up there, you can go pay your respects. Because that, my friends, is the beginning of refining in the United States. Doesn't look like much, but believe me, things changed. All of this competition, you see, to make kerosene, and I'd lost my patents anyhow. So what do? Then the real competition came. Because when Kerr was doing it, it was hard to get the oil. You had to skim it off and wring it out from blankets in a barrel. It took you all day long or more to get a barrel. Well, this gentleman put a hole in the ground and had 20 barrels a day. Bingo. The world changed. The world changed. By the late 1850s, these are just a few of the kerosene companies that were in operation. Lots of competition, to say the least, because it's so much easier to make the kerosene from petroleum than it is from coal. And so, in addition to meeting with my patients back in Nova Scotia, I also put my notes together in a book which was published in 1861 called A Practical Treatise on Coal, Petroleum, and Other Distilled Oils. And in there I had descriptions of various kinds of retorts and condensers, and one of them even was a rotating retort, because in using coal you have to keep the thing moving in order to get nice even heat. But of course that produces a problem, because then you create dust, and the dust then clogs the, coal really was a mess. Replace it with petroleum, a lot of your problems go away. But this proved to be pretty popular. And then later, posthumously, my son George edited and did a second edition, which came out in 1865, but it was a posthumous publication. I didn't have much to do with that one. And so, the age of 66, April 29th, which happens to be the day of my assistant's mother's birthday, so that date rang well with him. But of course, the accomplishments that occurred live on. Very definitely, they live on. In the year 2000, the Canadian government honored that work with a postage stamp. But perhaps, well, I was buried then in Camp Hill Cemetery in Halifax. And what I think was interesting, on the tombstone, it says that I died there, April so on. But what was interesting is that down here it says he was the American inventor of the process of kerosene. American, not Canadian, not Nova Scotian, but American. They included the whole upper part of the continent. What a great compliment that is. And not without merit. Not without merit. Because remember, I demonstrated that in 1846. Samuel Kerr was still putting it in a bottle and selling it as medicine. Not far from Kentville is a monument. Kentville's down here, and they put a monument in several years later to honor the achievements of Dr. Gesner. and one plaque in French, one plaque in English, and again, an honor that shows the importance of the work that was done in that early period of geological history, of the understanding of geology. But perhaps the greatest legacy is the fact that kerosene is still a major part of our world, to the extent that we produce and use on average about 15 million liters every hour of every day. That's a lot of kerosene. Jet fuel, diesel, bunker fuel for ships, all of these are kerosene derivatives. There is our legacy of the work that Abraham Gesner did. The forgotten discoverer of kerosene, not in this audience. And I thank you very much. Any questions? Yes, sir.
You had the list of all the companies making kerosene.
Yes.
Were they paying a royalty or anything for to anybody?
James Young got some of it, but it became just overwhelming. And so, to my knowledge, there was no royalties being paid anywhere, because they would, change the process a little bit and say, oh no, this is a new way of doing it, it's not his way. So to my knowledge, no, there were no royalties at all, other than ones that he fleeced out of the company in New York City. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
The son that posthumously
George.
did he continue in that career?
No, George, one of the sons became a surgeon. And George, as I remember, and I'd have to go back and check, after 220 years, you tend to forget these things. But he was in business, but still dabbled in sciences that way. But one of the sons did become a surgeon. Yeah. Oh boy, you turned the kerosene up. Anything else? Well, if not, thank you very much. You've been a delightful audience, and Gesner is no longer forgotten. Thank you. Oh, and we just happen to have a few books out in the lobby. Just thought I'd mention that.